All right, so we have another interesting case that's in the media. And Keith, if you wanted a master class on California trust litigation, this is the case because it has a little bit of everything in it. And it's a juicy case. There's lots of interesting facts, and it has to do with Robbie Robertson. And Robbie Robertson, I mean, what an incredible guy this was. He was a founding member of the band. I don't know if they're one of my favorite groups, but I certainly enjoy listening to their music. Ophelia comes to mind. This guy was an amazing artist, and he also was a solo artist. He did quite a bit of work. And then finally, he was a prolific film score producer. And I'm getting all of this from the Hollywood Reporter. There was a fantastic article on August the 9th of this year, 2024, by Seth Abramovich and Winston Cho. And it's about a 30-minute read, but it is juicy and interesting, and I hope they follow up on the reporting on this. But it's right down our alley as trust and estate litigators in California. And as we walked through the facts of this case, we see these facts time and time again in our cases. And so just, what was your gut reaction after you read the article?
Well, the whole setup or scenario is very common to cases we deal with. So you have a stepmother who comes in, a wife. Robbie Robertson's 80. She's, I think, 58, late 50s.
Yes.
The kids really are of Robbie Robertson are around the same age as she is, just a little bit younger, but not a lot. And of course, everything changes in terms of the finances and what ultimately is going to happen to this estate. And the kids are not happy about it. Their expectations are one thing, and of course the wife's expectations are another thing, and they clash. And part of the reason it's clashing is because Robbie Robertson probably didn't do the best estate planning, and there's different things that come up under the law when people get married. So we can kind of get into, or let me just give an overview of what was filed. So the whole case started.
Well, before we do that, let's give an overview of the case, but let's talk about who is who. So we have Robbie Robertson, who passed away about a year ago. And then we have his three children, Alexandra Robertson, Delphine Robertson, and Sebastian Robinson. And Sebastian's my same age. I'm 50, he's 50, so we share, growing up in the same era. And then the wife, who was the longtime girlfriend for about 5 years, I think Robbie Robertson, he met Janet Zuccarini in 2017. She's a restaurateur from Toronto, and she's down in the LA scene. And they dated for quite some time. And then about 5 months before he passed away, I believe it was February or March of 2023, they had kind of a surprise wedding. And none of the kids, the Robertson kids, knew about it. And they were just kind of shocked to find out that their dad had married Janet Zuccarini. So Zuccarini so obviously Robertson passes away. There's a funeral. I think everybody kind of gets along, like in most cases.
Yeah.
But then the fireworks start. And there's some filings done by Zuccarini in the probate court, and there's some probate court filings by the children. Now let's give an overview of those cases.
Yeah, excellent. So Zuccarini starts by filing a petition in the probate court asking for certain expenses to be reimbursed to her for things like cremation, flowers, catering. She wants these expenses reimbursed. Obviously, the kids are upset by that. They don't think that they owe those things. And so they file a petition for financial elder abuse and intentional interference with an expected inheritance. I think the reason why those claims have come is because of the underlying documents. We'll get into that. And then in response, Zuccarini files an omitted spouse petition where she is claiming that she's entitled to 1/3 of everything, regardless of any trust or will documents whatsoever.
And so the admitted spouse, Keith, is that where Robbie Robertson does not have a trust or will that he talks about his wife in, and of course he's now married to her. And so why is she saying she's entitled to 1/3 of his estate and not 1/2 of his estate or all of his estate?
So the claim of omitted spouse comes about if you create a trust and then or will, and then after that point in time you get married, but you don't change your trust and will, that spouse now has an intestate share. And that's an omitted spouse. So if you were to get married and then create a trust, no omitted spouse. But if you do it in reverse order. So that's what happened here. You have a trust, you have a later marriage, in theory, you have a claim, or at least the basis of potentially a claim for omitted spouse. There's some exceptions, potential exceptions in this case. But it's meant to protect a spouse. If you marry somebody, the law is going to presume that you must have wanted to benefit them under your trust and will. You just didn't get around to changing it. And so the law is going to change it for you. Now, you can vary that by doing an amendment to your trust and saying, even though I'm married or even though I'm about to get married, I do not want my spouse to receive any of my assets, my separate property or my half of the community, whatever. You can change it. But if you don't change it, then the default rule under California law is your spouse is going to get either one half if you only have one child or a third if you have two or more children. And so that's why she's claiming a third here, is because Robbie Robertson had 3 kids. But let's talk about kind of the documentation that I think led up to this. Because Robbie Robertson does have a trust in place that has to do with his house. The kids are in charge of that. The kids are supposed to, in theory, receive his assets out of his trust. But he also executed a tenant in common agreement because he bought this house supposedly with Zuccarini. They bought it together, although he's the one who put all the money into it. He also had a prenup before he got married, and that's going to be important. And but he did not, as far as I can tell, create an amendment to his trust. So all you have is those documents, and that lays the groundwork for the claims that we're seeing.
And I think the other important factor that came out of those documents is that Zuccarini gets a life estate in the house. And of course, that means that half of the expenses going forward, whatever those are, have to be supported by Robertson's estate. And so you've got these kids who thought that they were going to inherit some money. And Zuccarini's lawyers, according to the article, have gone out of their way to say these are greedy heirs. All they want is money, and that Robertson was supporting their expensive lifestyles when he was alive. We don't know if there's any truth to any of that. There may be some truth. There may not.
Common argument that we see all the time.
Common argument we see. So these are greedy heirs going against the poor widow. And the heirs are saying, no, Dad always intended for us to have his assets, and we're here to help if we can with the widow. But when we talked to Dad about this, in this case, Robertson always said, what's mine is mine and what's hers is hers. Because the kids did ask their dad at some point, hey, you know, you're with this Zuccarini and you got married, kind of a surprise marriage. What does that mean for us? And I think that's a natural thing for kids to ask. But now that's being thrown back in their face as if they were greedy heirs. And I don't think they're necessarily greedy heirs. Again, I don't know the facts of this case particularly, but it's a typical question we see in blended families where you have a much younger spouse, in this case, a wife coming along, and you have a much older husband who's going to pass away, and he's clearly sick and ill, and according to the children, couldn't even stand at the wedding, and he passes away, and then the question is, who gets all the assets? Well, the kids have had this lifelong relationship with their father, and you have, in their minds, a person that comes into his life relatively late, and now she's going to end up getting certainly the bulk of his estate because of these costs that are going to go forward. She's 58, I think, and it sounds like she's in wonderful shape. She's healthy. That's what the article says. She could live quite some time, and the kids are going to have to fund one half of her expenses going forward.
Yeah, I mean, a life estate is for life. And interesting thing about the life estate, so they're saying, the kids are saying that it's going to cost them $50,000 a month to maintain the house. That's what they're going to have to pay. They're saying that really the only asset of the estate is the house, which is worth around $6 million, which is a little confusing to me because apparently Mr. Robertson sold his publishing catalog for $25 million in 2022. I don't know what happened to that money, but apparently their inheritance is somewhere in the low 7 figures.
By the way, that seems a little bit low to me for the publishing. I don't know, what did that include? Because if it was all of the band's work, it seems to me that it would be worth more money than that. But we'll rely on the reporting.
And how was it structured? Maybe it was payment over time, so maybe it's not money in the bank right now. But the kids don't have the money to pay $50,000 a month to maintain the life estate is the problem.
Right.
Their understanding is the house was going to be sold. Either Zuccarini would have the option to buy out the half that belonged to Robertson, or they would just sell it and split the proceeds.
Right.
That is not what's on the tenant in common agreement. I also want to note that it's a little uncommon in most life estates that I see, and I've reviewed, 35,000 trusts in my career, and you've reviewed a similar number. In most life estates, the life tenant is the one who has to pay the expenses.
They're on the hook, yes.
So yeah, they can live there rent-free for life, but they are the ones that have to pay for the upkeep and the maintenance and all that. And if they don't, then they have to get out. Whereas here, under the agreement that Robertson had with Zuccarini, it's his estate that has to pay all those things. So it's a particularly favorable life estate that is I wouldn't say that it's entirely uncommon, but it's not typical. It's not what you typically see in life estates. And you can kind of see why, because it puts a huge burden on the people who aren't getting the asset, and now they have to carry this burden for many, many years. And that's ultimately where the problem lies, is this whole thing is a huge financial problem, and that's why everybody's fighting.
So the kids will not be able, if Zuccarini lives a long life, which it appears that she likely will, the kids are saying, look, this bankrupts the estate. We're not going to get anything. And then think about that. Every single month, they're having to write checks to somebody who they don't like. And of course, she doesn't like them. These are very heated cases. They're very emotional cases. And here you're going to have to go on almost in a prison sentence working with Zuccarini. And she may view it, Zuccarini may also view it as a prison sentence, and that she has to deal with the kids going forward. And the kids are saying, look, we're not going to pay for this and that. So the kids filed a financial elder abuse claim against Zuccarini. Can you walk us through what a financial elder abuse claim is?
So what they're trying to do is they want to set aside this tenant in common agreement. And what they're saying is that Zuccarini used financial elder abuse, probably undue influence, because one of the bases for a financial elder abuse claim is that if somebody takes assets using undue influence. And so they're saying, well, by forcing Robertson to sign this tenant in common agreement, we think that you, Zuccarini, exercised undue influence to force him or coerce him into signing this agreement, and you benefited from that by essentially what amounts to receiving the whole estate under this agreement. And so if they filed the financial elder abuse claim, if they were to prevail, they would get damages in the amount that Zuccarini would receive under the estate, the amount that's what she took under the financial elder abuse claim. And she could also be on the hook for things like attorney's fees and double damages and things like that. That's not commonly received in financial elder abuse claims, but it is a pretty big claim to bring. It's a big stick to pound somebody with. And that's what they're filing in this case. So we'll see how that plays out.
And we have not reviewed any pleadings in this case. We've just read this outstanding article in the Hollywood Reporter. And maybe at some point we can break into the pleadings and we can put those up on the screen and walk through those. But the one thing that's hitting me here is that there's no Penal Code 496 claim, apparently, according to the article. There's a financial elder abuse claim, and there's intentional interference with an expected inheritance, which I'm not sure if that claim can stand, because there may be an adequate probate remedy, but there may not be an adequate probate remedy. These are tenant in common. It's a contract. You got the premarital agreement. Maybe those can be attacked on that. So maybe those aren't adequate probate remedies. That still has to be determined. But it seems to me that there is a Penal Code 496 claim that can be made here, because the kids could allege that Zuccarini misdirected these assets, which is a form of theft. And there is treble damages that go with a Penal Code 496 claim as well. So I'm not sure. We'll break into the pleadings at some point and go through them. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely enough to allege a Penal Code 496 claim. And that's just a theft claim. Somebody steals something. And I think when you take something from somebody else by way of a sweetheart deal or an agreement, I think that could be categorized as a theft, at least good enough to allege it. The 496 claim is not a well-known claim yet. You're seeing it be used a little bit more and more, not as much as it probably could be used, because it's not widely understood yet. We've used it to great effect in a number of cases where it was appropriate, where we did see evidence and we had facts to allege a theft. But I think this one could fit that. I really do, at least for allegations. Whether or not it pans out and wins at the time of trial, I don't know. You'd have to look at the evidence, but certainly enough to allege it. Yeah.
So one other thing here is that, I don't know what portfolio and what intellectual property was included in the sale that he got $25 million for, but it does appear there are other projects and sources of income from intellectual property that will continue to come to his estate. One of those would be he was working on Killers of the Flower Moon, which is a recent movie with Leonardo DiCaprio. And who's the famous...
Martin Scorsese.
Martin Scorsese, yeah, the famous director on that. And then I think Martin Scorsese was good friends with Robertson through the years. Robertson had actually worked on scores for Casino, Gangs of New York, and The Wolf of Wall Street. So if there are royalties, intellectual property that continues to come into the estate, that is something for the kids to think about. Is this worth moving forward on? And, Zuccarini could live for another year. She could live for another 30, 35, 40 years, depending on how things go here. And so they have to figure out, is it worth it for them to move forward? What are your thoughts just on the assessments? I know we've only read an article on this, and we haven't gotten into the evidence and the facts. How hard is it for the for the Robertson children to win these claims against Zuccarini at trial, if you were to handicap it with what you know right now?
It's interesting. So for the financial elder abuse and those type of claims that the kids filed, those aren't the easiest claims to win. I think that the parties did have attorneys here that looked at this stuff, which is going to kind of undermine their financial elder abuse claim, because if everybody had experts looking at this, advising them, it's a little bit harder to say that somebody acted under undue influence. Zuccarini and Robertson were together for 5 years. That means something. The interesting thing about the omitted spouse claim that Zuccarini is bringing is there was a prenup in this case, and they reference that in the article. We have not reviewed it. I haven't seen it. But it's very common in prenuptial agreements to say that the spouses are waiving any intestate inheritance rights they have. That would defeat the omitted spouse claim. And that could be a writing that would have happened. And if you do a writing right before you get married and you put down there that you don't want your spouse to inherit, you don't want omitted spouse to apply, that is an exception to omitted spouse. So I kind of wonder if the omitted spouse claims that strong, but the kids definitely have an uphill battle on the financial elder abuse and their intentional interference claims. They have the burden of proof. They have to prove that there was really undue influence here. And yes, Robertson was suffering from cancer. He was on different medications. That in and of itself is not necessarily enough to show somebody who's susceptible to undue influence. But it all comes down to, in this case, I'm assuming that they filed the financial elder abuse either in civil court or they filed it in probate and asked for a jury. I hope they did, because it'll all come down to a jury if it goes to trial.
That's important to point out. In probate cases, you generally are entitled to only a bench trial, which is a judge reviewing your case. And there's nothing wrong with bench trials. There's good judges out there. But the one thing, when you bring a civil claim in probate court, such as financial elder abuse and intentional infliction, I get the claims messed up here, the intentional interference with an expected inheritance, those are civil claims that are subject to a jury trial. And the problem that we have found in many of these cases is that the probate court will put everything on trial first in the bench trial. And so once a judge makes findings in a case, those would apply to future matters where there are similar facts and circumstances. And so it's difficult then to go forward with the jury trial if you lose in the probate court. So that's one thing. That's just a procedural thing to keep in mind. The one thing that strikes me is there anyone else besides the kids that can testify that Robertson said, look, we did a prenup, which he kept telling his kids. We've done all the planning. He kept telling his kids. And what's mine is mine, and you guys are going to get that. And what's hers is hers. She's a very wealthy entrepreneur. She's worth, $100 million, apparently, according to the article, was the idea that she was worth $100 million. Are there other people that don't have a dog in the hunt that can testify to that? Because if they can testify that Robertson believed that everything from his side would go to his children ultimately, and there's also some evidence that he put the down payment from the house he sold on their new home that they bought together with the idea that COVID had happened and she was having some cash flow issues with their restaurants. That makes sense. The restaurants are shut down during COVID. But he said, she'll pay me back in the future. So there was some type of business arrangement between these two people, even though they did end up getting married. Albeit under some suspicious circumstances in my mind. You're getting married without anybody being there. The kids aren't there. You're not noticing anybody. It's 5 months before he dies. There are some exceptions to omitted spouse, Keith, and one of them we see that pops up all the time is that Robbie Robertson may have provided for Zuccarini outside of the trust document, and therefore she doesn't get 1/3 as an omitted spouse. Walk us through that analysis.
Yeah, So there's a number of exceptions to omitted spouse. So one is if you provide for your spouse outside of your trust, and it's what is considered a substantial amount, which is up to the trier of fact to decide, then the omitted spouse doesn't apply. So here you would say, well, he provided a life estate in a $6 million home plus payment of all expenses. That seems like you're providing for somebody outside of the trust. It seems like that would be an exception to omitted spouse. Second exception that could apply here, because the marriage wasn't at least 6 months, is if Zuccarini was viewed as a caretaker of Mr. Robertson, she took care of him, she provided him food, and then they got married while she was taking care of him, and the marriage wasn't at least 6 months, then she could be an impermissible donee, somebody who cannot take because they're a caretaker. So that's a second exception to omitted spouse. And then the third one I already mentioned is the prenup. And if the prenup waived any intestate rights, that'd be another exception to omitted spouse.
And the other question, too, is the prenup even valid? Because there's some really harsh rules on how prenups have to be created. And we're assuming here that lawyers were hired for Robertson and Zuccarini in that process, and there was the cool-off period that happens for premarital agreements. You used to work on premarital agreements, didn't you?
Yeah, and they're very technical. I mean, you have to have the 7-day waiting period. Each party has to have an opportunity to have a lawyer. Ideally, each party has a lawyer. You have to have a full disclosure of assets. I mean, they're very technical, and if you miss any one of those things, the prenup is no good. I think the other thing that strikes me, though, when you're talking about how Robertson always told his kids what's mine is mine and what's hers is generally speaking, that was a true statement here. What he may not have fully appreciated is forcing the estate to pay $50,000 a month in expenses for Zuccarini's lifetime is kind of a backdoor way of draining the estate when the estate doesn't have the money to do that. Now, if this estate was $100 million, but you have to pay $50 million a month or $50,000 a month to Zuccarini, that's a drop in the bucket. But when you're talking about an amount that will literally bankrupt the estate over the next, 10, 20 years, it's kind of a backdoor way to drain the estate. And I think that's what the kids are upset about is that, well, somebody kind of pulled the wool over Dad's eyes and didn't really explain to him just what a disaster this was.
And he was 80 years old. So let's be clear on this. Even if he could have full cognition as an 80-year-old prior to his passing, he clearly was very ill. Prostate cancer. Apparently he'd had it for 25 years, which just is amazing. They had it in remission for a while, and then it came back, got into his spine and in his brain. The medical records are going to be super important here to go through. But back to the omitted spouse issue, where there is an exception if Robertson provided for Zuccarini outside of the trust. Here, you've already mentioned the things that he provided for her, the life estate and whatever else she gets under the premarital agreement. It seems to me that there was a case recently that said, look, if somebody gives you rent, just free rent as a caregiver or as a person that's there, that's enough to satisfy a meaningful amount of money given to you that's outside of the trust. So the omitted spouse claim, based on only an article, we've not gotten into the pleadings, seems to me that's not a very strong claim here if, in fact, Zuccarini was getting stuff outside the trust. More problematic, though, is what you're getting to, and there's this back door. Did Robertson know? Did he intend for his children to have to front this money for Zuccarini? It's very one-way street, as the article points out. It all benefited Zuccarini. It did not flow back to Robertson. And of course, everybody understood here that Robertson was likely to die first because of his advanced age over his wife. And so there's a lot of richness in this case. The financial elder abuse is an interesting claim by the kids. It's all going to come down to the facts, witnesses, and the documents. If those can show that Zuccarini was the one that was making the appointment with the lawyers, they were, taking him at times when he was on medication, when it truly was just her calling the shots. But here's the problem. She's his wife. And if she was his girlfriend, I think this is an easier case for the children. But he married her. And if he intended to marry her, then, like you say, there's some presumptions that the law is going to make about that.
Yeah, the marriage definitely throws a wrench in the work for the kids. There's no doubt about it. Although 5 months might kind of help them a little bit,
right?
But not necessarily a lot. That marriage is a problem. But I think we both can agree that there's a lot of things to argue on both sides of this case. And what that usually means is the parties are going to duke it out. They're going to fight it out. And at some point, they're probably going to go to a mediation and settle the case, right? A vast majority of cases are going to settle before trial. So what would a settlement look like in this case? I mean, did the kids just give up the house entirely but give us the royalties? Or do they agree to sell the house and split it 50-50, which the wife wouldn't want? She's entitled to more than just 50-50 because of her life estate and what goes along with that.
Right.
So where is the settlement in a case like this?
It's hard because these larger estates like this, where there's so much money involved, and Zuccarini, if I'm putting myself in her shoes, she's saying, "Hey, I'm entitled to this stuff. I have it in writing. You have to overcome it." So she feels very confident in that. The kids are saying, "Dad always said we were going to get this, and we feel very strongly about that." So there's strong feelings here. And so even though it may not make rational economic sense, both sides are going to dig in here pretty hard. But like you said, there'll be a lot of discovery. There'll be depositions. There is apparently another issue where Zuccarini apparently, and this is just an allegation, didn't pay one of her general contractors to the tune of $500,000 or so pertaining to one of her restaurants. So you're going to have these other issues that have nothing to really do with anything, just to basically impugn the character of Zuccarini. So they can say, well, this is who she is. This is how she behaves.
Yeah, a lot of mudslinging.
A lot of mudslinging. And then, of course, the kids, they're just greedy heirs, and they haven't made successes of their own life. Their father, who clearly was a very bright and successful, talented man. And that's kind of interesting. He came from Canada, and he came from an indigenous mother up there. It sounds like she might have even been a single mom. Am I getting that wrong from the article? Or
I think that's right.
And look at this guy. I mean, he's amazing and a good-looking guy all the way to the end. Very good-looking.
Yeah, he did amazing things with his life. He's very fortunate. He obviously had an estate afterwards. But yeah, it's a complete mess now. But that's not uncommon for us. We deal with messes. That's all we deal with. I think ultimately it'll be interesting to know what the royalties are worth and where that $25 million went and how it's being paid. Is it being paid over time, and how would you value that? It might come to pass that the kids are just going to have to, give up a bigger portion of the house to settle this at some point than they would otherwise want to, in order to protect the royalties, if the royalties are worth protecting in that way, if they're worth that kind of money.
Well, the thing that kind of shocks me here is that you're talking about a $6 million house, which that's an expensive house, but it's Los Angeles, and I think it's Beverly Hills.
Yeah, it's not a $65 million house.
No, and so, I guess he had sold his previous house and used the money from that $1.5 million to pay for this house. I mean, I don't know all the details of that transaction. It does seem like this estate should be larger.
It's not uncommon for famous people to not have as much money as you think they do.
That's true.
And we've worked on celebrity estates in the past, and I'm always a little bit surprised by how little a lot of celebrities have. I think they have a lot of fame, and I think people assume that with fame comes riches. And maybe riches do come from that, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily good at managing money. Maybe they spend a lot, maybe they haven't invested well. Whatever it is. But yeah, it is shocking at how often famous people are not that rich.
Well, and keep in mind the $25 million, many people listening in will say, well, he got $25 million. That's more than, a whole block of blue collar workers can make in a lifetime. That's true, but he also had to pay, likely without proper tax planning, there's 50% or more of that went to taxes. And so you're already cutting that in half. And then these people tend to live larger lifestyles than the average person, and it's very expensive. And of course, when you're funding restaurants, if that's in fact what was happening here, if you're paying for an extravagant lifestyle, that money can go very quickly.
And when in the entertainment industry, you're usually paying managers and agents, and
Yes.
they get a percentage of that too. So the big amount, it sounds impressive, but it gets whittled down pretty quickly. And again, it might be that, a lot of times you'll sell a company or royalty rights for some big number, 25 million, but you don't get 25 million up front. You get some amount of money, and then it's paid over time because people want to make sure that they got value for what they're paying for. So who knows how this was structured? But apparently it wasn't structured with, here's 25 million, because the kids have already said there's not that much in the estate.
I'll end on this point, Keith. It looks like he had a very good relationship with his children. Apparently had a good relationship with Zuccarini, and I'm sure she'll put that forward at trial if it does end up in trial. More than likely this case settles a year, 2, 3 from now. Very expensive during that time. But he did love his children, it appears. He had good relationships with them. A lot of times we see these cases where the kids don't have a very good relationship with their father or their mother who passed away, and that makes it more problematic. So I think the kids have some good arguments here. Right now, I'm calling it a 50-50 case. It could go either way, which bodes well for resolving this at mediation. But unfortunately, like most cases, you're going to have to go through a little bit of catharsis, which is the discovery process. People have to go through the pain of deposition. And then at some point, people get smart and go, this is painful for everybody. We're all losing money. This is very expensive. How do we resolve this so we can all move forward with our lives? That's where all of these people need to get. Zuccarini needs to get there. The Robertson children need to get there. The only way to get there, though, is to have a little bloodletting on both sides.
Yeah, you have to go through the fight first. I would call it a 51-49% case, just to be difficult.
All right.
But I'm not going to tell you which side is 51.
Okay, all right.
Until I see who wins.
And then you're going to say, I thought this all along?
I told you so.
Okay,
yeah. All right. Awesome. Well, that's our update on Robbie Robertson.
Yeah, we'll come back if there's more articles that come out, and we may dig into some of the pleadings here just because this is such a rich case, and it really does kind of encapsulate all the issues we deal with on trust contest cases in California.
Yeah, every day.
Yep.